The cameras rolled. The lights burned bright. The air inside the studio was thick with anticipation. Across America, millions tuned in, their eyes locked on the screen, waiting. Something big was coming. At least that's what the network had promised. A revelation so explosive, so undeniable, that even the most loyal supporters wouldn't be able to look away. The live sign glowed red. The energy in the room shifted. The audience leaned forward, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. And then Brian Lasker smirked. Tonight, he wasn't just hosting a segment. He was delivering a moment. Takedown. A story that would dominate headlines by morning. His fingers laced together as he leaned in, eyes glinting with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth, steady, calculated. "This is the truth they don't want you to hear." The crowd erupted, cheers, murmurs, a few scattered boos. Brian welcomed it all. Controversy was fuel, and tonight he was pouring gasoline on the fire. But across the city, far from the flashing cameras and roaring audience, Melania Trump sat in silence. Her penthouse was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the television. The glow from the screen flickered against her face, casting sharp shadows. She had heard his name before, seen his face, watched his show, but something about tonight felt different. Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. She didn't know it yet, but before this night was over, she would be the one making headlines. Brian Lasker leaned forward, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the sharp gleam in his eyes. He knew exactly how to hold a crowd, how to feed them just enough to keep them hungry for more. His guest, a former Trump ally now turned critic, sat rigid in his chair. His face was tight, voice low. "Trump knew," he said. "He didn't just know. He orchestrated it." The audience tensed. A murmur ran through the crowd, rippling like a wave. They didn't even know what it was yet. But that didn't matter. The suspense had already done its job. A bold headline flashed on the screen behind Brian. "Trump's darkest secret exposed." Gasps, scattered applause. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags started trending in real time. Hashtag Trump exposed. Hashtag Melania silence speaks. Hashtag lies uncovered. In her penthouse, Melania's fingers curled tighter around her glass. The ice clinked softly against the sides. She exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together. This wasn't new. She had watched this unfold 100 times before. Segments built on carefully edited clips, selective outrage, and headlines crafted to provoke. The truth wasn't important. The reaction was. But tonight, she wasn't just watching them go after her husband. Tonight, they were coming for her. Brian's smirk widened. His voice softened, taking on an almost sympathetic tone. "We all wonder," he said, tilting his head slightly. "How much does Melania really know?" The audience chuckled. His guest shook his head, offering a knowing smile. Brian continued, dragging the moment out, savoring it. "She stands by him, silent, always composed, no matter the scandal, no matter the backlash." He let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "But is she loyal? Or is she trapped?" The words settled over the room. Trapped. Melania inhaled sharply. She had been called many things over the years. An enigma, a mystery, an accomplice, a victim. But trapped? That was a word meant for women without choices, without power, without control. And that had never been her. A slow shift occurred inside her, subtle but certain. For years, she had played the role they assigned her. Let them paint their own version of her life, her marriage, her silence. They made assumptions, filled in gaps with their own conclusions, wrote her story without ever asking if it was true. And she had let them. But tonight felt different. Her eyes flicked toward the phone resting beside her. She could stay quiet, ignore it like always, let them have their moment, let the headlines run their course. Or she could remind them exactly who she was. Her hand hovered over the phone. For the first time in a long time, she felt the urge to speak. Melania's fingers hovered over the phone, her pulse steady. The voices from the television filled the silence around her, but her mind had already moved beyond them. She made her decision. The call connected. Inside the studio, Brian Lasker leaned back, completely in his element. His smirk widened as he prepared to deliver another blow. He had the crowd exactly where he wanted them. Then his earpiece crackled to life. "Brian, you're not gonna believe this." He barely glanced up, still riding the energy of the room. "Try me." The producer's voice was urgent now. "Melania Trump is on the line. She wants to go live." Brian's expression shifted. For the first time that night, he looked caught off guard. Silence settled over the studio. The audience, once eager to react to his every word, now sat motionless. Even his guest, who had been so confident moments ago, shifted uneasily in his seat. This wasn't supposed to happen. Melania never responded. She let stories run, let the media fill in the blanks. She had spent years in silence, never breaking her composure. Until now. Brian quickly regained his composure, straightening in his chair. A slow, confident grin crept back onto his face. This was a gift. He nodded toward the control room. "Patch her through." A few beats of silence stretched over the room, thick and heavy. Then her voice came through, calm, controlled, with an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. "You should be careful what you say about people you don't know, Brian." The audience gasped. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time that night, he wasn't the one in control. Brian forced a smile, recovering quickly. "Oh, Melania, come on," he said, shaking his head. "We both know you're just here to clean up your husband's mess." His tone was casual, dismissive, but there was something forced about it. Melania didn't flinch. "No, Brian," she said smoothly. "I called because I'm tired of men like you pretending to fight for women while using us as punchlines in your performances." The room shifted. The laughter that had filled the studio just moments ago was gone. The audience, once eager to cheer, now sat uncertain. Even Brian's guest, who had been nodding along so confidently before, avoided eye contact. Brian let out a short laugh. Too loud. Too quick. "Melania," he said, trying to keep the control in his voice. "This isn't about you. It's about the truth. If your husband is innocent, why are you so defensive?" Melania exhaled slowly. "You assume I'm calling to defend my husband," she said, her voice steady. "I'm defending myself." Brian blinked. This wasn't the response he expected. She continued, "You call me trapped, Brian, but we both know who's really stuck in a role they can't escape." A murmur ran through the audience. The energy in the room had shifted. Brian leaned forward, tightening his grip on the desk. "I'm stuck," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You're the one who stands beside him, silent, always smiling, always playing along." Melania's tone remained calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. "And you?" she asked. "You sit in that chair every night, reading the same script, saying what your audience expects to hear, pretending it makes you different." Brian's jaw tightened. She continued, "You act like you challenge power, but you only go after people when it's safe. You attack the ones your audience already hates. You don't expose corruption, Brian. You sell outrage." The silence in the studio was deafening. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in his career, his own tactics had been turned against him. Brian Lasker's smirk wavered. His fingers twitched against the desk, a flicker of tension crossing his face. He heard his producer's voice crackle in his earpiece. "Urgent now. Brian, wrap it up. You're losing control." The warning was clear, but there was no easy way out. The audience, once buzzing with laughter and anticipation, now sat in uncomfortable silence. The mood had shifted. The usual rhythm of his show, build up, attack, deliver the final blow, was broken. Melania had flipped the script. Brian forced a tight smile. "Well, Melania," he said, tilting his head slightly, "I have to admit, you're a lot more talkative when your husband isn't standing next to you." There it was, his attempt to regain control, to turn her words into another punchline. But Melania didn't hesitate. Her voice remained steady, unwavering. And you're a lot less confident when someone challenges you directly. The audience stirred. A few shifted in their seats. Some exchanged glances. Brian tapped his fingers against the desk. He could hear the buzz in the control room, his team scrambling to fix the situation. But there was no fixing this. Melania had said what she needed to say. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. She had already won. A quiet beat passed. Then, without another word, she ended the call. Click. The studio fell silent. Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, he had nothing left to say. Meanwhile, outside the studio, the internet had exploded. Hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag Melania owned Brian. Hashtag Brian Lasker exposed. Hashtag media manipulation. People who had tuned in expecting to see another scandal unfold were now watching something entirely different. This wasn't about Trump anymore. This was about her. Brian's earpiece crackled again. Brian, move on, fast. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat, forcing another laugh. Well, he said, his voice tight, that was interesting. A few scattered chuckles came from the crowd, but it wasn't the reaction he was used to. He tried again. She called in. She said her piece, but let's be honest. Did she actually answer anything? This time, no one responded. Brian could feel it now. The shift. The energy in the room wasn't the same. This was supposed to be a segment that dominated headlines, that kept him in control of the conversation. Instead, Melania had turned the entire thing upside down. And the world was already reacting. The newsroom was in chaos. Screens flickered with headlines. Phones buzzed non-stop. Producers scrambled to adjust their coverage. This wasn't the story they had planned. The focus was supposed to be on Trump, another scandal, another controversy. Instead, the internet had shifted its attention. Not to the former president, to her. Rival networks, usually quick to tear Melania apart, hesitated. Some analysts, even those known for their criticism, acknowledged the moment for what it was. She did something rare, one commentator admitted. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She turned the entire conversation back on Brian Lasker. Another side. The worst part? He did it to himself. Back at the penthouse, Melania turned off the television. The screen went dark, leaving only the glow of the city beyond her windows. Her phone vibrated again. Calls, messages. People she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had something to say. Some from the political world trying to assess the damage. Others simply watching from the sidelines, unsure what came next. She ignored them. She reached for her phone, but not to check the flood of notifications. She dialed one number. The call rang twice before a familiar voice came through. Melania. Donald Trump's tone was unreadable. A pause stretched between them. Then, a low chuckle. I saw the show. She said nothing. You did good. His voice carried something she rarely heard from him. Pride. Melania didn't respond. Not because she needed his approval. Because, for the first time, she didn't need anyone's. For years, the world had written her story for her. Tonight, she wrote her own. And the world had no choice but to listen. The world had watched in silence. The conversation had shifted. The headlines weren't what they expected. Melania Trump had done something no one saw coming. But the real question remains, was this just a moment, or was it something bigger? Did she finally show the world a side of herself no one had seen before? Or did she simply remind everyone that she was never the person they thought she was? One thing is certain, this wasn't the way the night was supposed to end. Now, we want to hear from you. Did Melania take control of her own narrative? Did Brian Lasker underestimate the woman he thought would stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the stories that shake the internet, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because in a world where everyone thinks they know the truth, sometimes all it takes is one moment to change everything.